join us, which is too bad. I know he was really looking forward to tonight's talk. We'll come to the land acknowledgement in just a couple of minutes. We've reordered things slightly for this evening in order to take advantage of a few special guests. I would like to let everyone know that this past September was a major milestone for the university as we marked 20 years since opening our doors to our first incoming class. Through this 2023-2024 academic year, we look forward to numerous events and initiatives that will showcase the university's past, present, and future as we celebrate with students, faculty, staff, alumni, partners, donors, the community, and beyond. Keep your eyes open for more special events as we celebrate our 20-year anniversary. Now I'd like to introduce Mark Sayers. Mark Sayers is a Doctor of Education candidate in Ontario Tech's Education faculty and has recently been awarded Ontario's Tech's Indigenous Dissertation Completion and Teaching Fellowship. Mark is a full status and Treaty Ojibwe and Anishinaabe Nini who grew up in his home community of the Garden River First Nation. Mark's research aims to use education and digital technologies to promote Ojibwe culture, language, and history for learners in an Ojibwe-based post-secondary learning environment, and to create a culture-specific instructional design framework for Ojibwe-based post-secondary online education. Mark.
Anin, everybody. Before I speak, I just want to get one of my students, Haley Tucker, to do the land acknowledgement.
Hello, everyone. I'm Haley. Ontario Tech University acknowledges the lands and the peoples of Mississauga and Scugog Island First Nation. We are thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. The lands we are situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties and the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. These lands were made home to a number of Indigenous nations and people. We acknowledge the land out of respect for the Indigenous nations who have cared for Turtle Island, also called North America, from before the arrival of the settler peoples until this day. Most importantly, we remember the history of the lands that has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of friendship with the First Nations who call them home. This history is something that we are all affected by as we are all treaty people in Canada. We have a shared history to reflect on, and each of us is affected by this history in different ways. Our past defines our present, but if we move forward as friends and allies, then it does not have to define our future. Thank you.
Miigwech Haley, and I know I have some other students from my class who showed up, so if you're here, give me a little wave, I hope. Oh yeah, there they are, I can see them all, yeah. So part of when Anishinaabe people come into to gatherings, to events, to ceremonies, it's part of our traditional protocol to identify ourselves in our language. So for me, I'm going to speak my language here. Zawzat Makwanini and Nishnaka, Kitaganzi B, Donjaba, Anishinaabe, Nadaw, Anishinaabe, and Gitsimak, Jichak Doram, Minogijagat, Mino Modest, Anaweko, Gago, Gego, Chananamanangwa, Kawin Jada, Nado Gigaro Bungi, and Anishinaabe, Moaneta. So that's my introduction in my language. And I just want to just quickly say to Allison King, Dr. Allison King, who brought me on for the dissertation, the Indigenous Dissertation Fellowship, where I'm also a sessional instructor teaching for the school for Ontario Tech. I just want to say thank you, Allison, and to the other staff at Ontario Tech for having faith in me that I can lead the introduction to Indigenous studies. And of course we have Haley here. She's one of my students. First time I met her in person, and she I asked the class if somebody can come in and do the land acknowledgement, and she volunteered. So I'm happy about that. And but from here I just want to introduce our guest speaker. So in the Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere, Dr. Paulette Steeves, Cree Métis scholar, will discuss her groundbreaking work on decolonizing North American origins. Her work indicates that, contrary to popular opinion, which holds that people crossed the Bering Strait some 16,000 years ago, Indigenous people were living and thriving on Turtle Island as far back as 130,000 years and perhaps earlier. Dr. Paulette Steeves, PhD, is an Indigenous archaeologist. She was born in Whitehorse and spent her formative years in Lillooet, BC. She holds a BA in anthropology from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville and a master's and PhD in anthropology from the State University of New York at Binghamton. She was interim director of the Native American Studies program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst before taking an assistant professor position at Mount Allison University. She is currently the Canada Research Chair in Healing and Reconciliation at Algoma University, where she is also an associate professor and department chair of sociology and anthropology and a faculty member of the Geography, Geology, and Land Management program. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Paulette Steeves.
Nancy, hello. Thank you for inviting me here this evening. It's an honor. So my recent publication is titled The Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere. And the reason I called it the Paleolithic was because an Indigenous person, in following in the footsteps of people like Vine Deloria Jr., we have to retain a sense of humor. We have to make that space for keeping things light. And as American archaeologists have continually denied that there was ever a Paleolithic in the Americas, it was my way of keeping it fun, of poking back at them. So I called it the Indigenous Paleolithic. So research is ceremony. Research framed in Indigenous method and theory is based on respect, relationality, and reciprocity. If your research is not going to give back to the people you're doing research with and for, then you shouldn't do it. It is a praxis that weaves through institutional and public spaces to create social change. So research is not just about getting data and results. It's about creating Pamatsuin, a good life and good change in our world. My place in being a part of this ceremony of research and in telling this story was told to me within a discussion I had with a Salish elder, Leonard Sampson in Lillooet in 1998. I went to see Leonard when I was going through a difficult time in my life. I was going through a divorce, becoming a single parent, and I was asking his advice. And he said to me what I was going through at the time was difficult, but it was part of a lesson to learn how to deal with very difficult things. Leonard told me that him and the elders had talked about me my whole life, and they knew that I had a job to do that would be even harder than what I was going through at the time. He said, what you're going to do in the future, he said, we know will help Indian people everywhere, not just us, but it's going to be a lot harder than this. And at the time, I was a single parent, 3 kids, a greater education, a truck, and 26 cents. Didn't know where I was going. I couldn't imagine anything harder, but I never forgot his words. And when I was graduating with my PhD in 2015, I realized, oh, this is what Leonard meant. I just have to rewrite world history to include the Americas. Got this. So in sharing details of who I am, I claim my ancestry, acknowledge my ancestors, and declare my position as a researcher and an author. I intentionally locate myself as an Indigenous person first and a researcher second. This presents the ways of being, knowing, and doing that my research is based in. Oh, sorry, that's a picture of Lillooet, where I grew up. It's right along the Fraser River in British Columbia. So, stories go in circles. Everyone has been taught for decades to think in lines, point A to point B. But for Indigenous people, our history, our lives, our stories, they go in circles. They don't go in straight lines. So it helps if you listen in circles, because there are stories inside and in between stories. And finding your way through them is as easy and as hard as finding your way home. Part of finding is getting lost. So if you get lost, it's okay, because when you are lost, that is when you listen. So in an Indigenous methodology, stories do the work of decolonization. I know that everyone has heard that word, decolonization. So Aman Sayam and Eric Riskies argued that stories are decolonization theory in its most natural form. They are resurgent moments which reclaim epistemic ground that was erased by colonization. In processes of resistance, resurgence, and reclamation, stories lay the foundational framework for Indigenous sovereignty and the reclamation of material ground. Archaeologists have created many stories regarding the Indigenous past of the Western Hemisphere. They've done that without talking to Indigenous people for over 100 years. But they rarely ever consulted with the communities whose stories they were telling. They never consulted with the community about their oral history and their ties to the land. And it's interesting, if you go and you want to do archaeology in Greece or in Italy, there are a lot of countries anywhere else in the world, your studies and your degree need to hold a record of you learning about the history of those countries and those people. However, in the Americas, there are no archaeology programs in Canada or the USA that require students who become archaeologists with their degrees to take a course on Indigenous history, to earn a degree in archaeology that becomes a license to do archaeology and write the histories of Indigenous people that become the literature used to teach the next generation Indigenous histories. It's very odd. I did a huge study. I had students look for 6 months. We could not find one course in the United States or Canada that required a class on Indigenous history to get a license in archaeology. We need to change that. So what people have been traditionally taught about the deep Indigenous past is often framed more by what they are not taught, rather than by what they are taught. Academic discussions of First People in the lands we know today as the Americas continue to be framed in agontology, defined as how knowledge has not come to be, and how ignorance is produced through neglect, secrecy, suspicion, suppression, destruction of documents, unquestioned traditions, and social political selectivity. Educational materials framed in agontology support colonization of the mind, the heart, the spirit, teaching people to think in ways acceptable to colonization, to the nation state, and not to question the so-called scientific authorities. What people have been traditionally taught about the deep Indigenous past is often more framed in what they are not taught, rather than what they are taught. They are not taught that in the present day, there are over 6,000 distinct cultural groups in the Americas. They are not taught that on a global scale, the greatest diversity of language families is in the Americas. Europe has 4 language families. California alone has 15. North and South America hold over 180 of the language families of the world. It takes 6,000 years for one language family to even begin to form. So imagine how many thousands of years it would take for 180 language families to form. So academic discussions of First People in the lands we know today as the Americas continue to be framed in agontology. They continue to be framed in what students are not taught, how ignorance is produced through neglect and destruction of documents and unquestioned traditions. So it's really important for students to be aware. It's not just about what you're being taught in your education. You need to think about what you are not being taught that has been blocked by academic histories of colonization. So the indigenous past of the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, has been fabricated to fit into neoliberal timeframes of imagined new worlds. I'm sure that everyone has heard about the old world and the new world. Here's the thing. There's only one world. The whole thing is old. There's no such thing as the new world. That's simply a way of dehumanizing indigenous cultures who are claimed to have only been evolving for a very short time. So the past has traditionally been, in many ways, remains a tool of disempowerment and dehumanizing oppression created by American archaeologists to keep indigenous civilizations as infantile on a global scale. So in the Americas, the deep indigenous past prior to 12,000 years before the present has been aggressively denied for over a century. Archaeologists who braved challenging their academic peers, who published on sites that were older than 12,000 years, faced an uncertain future. It was called an area of academic suicide. That's not science. That's not academic. That's racism. Archaeologists claim the Clovis mystery was solved. So the first people were called the Clovis people, based over a tool that was found near Clovis, New Mexico. You can still find many statements today online, such as ancient people of North America's Clovis culture migrated to South America 11,000 years ago. Here's the thing. Clovis is not a culture. Clovis was a stone tool. A culture has language. It has housing. It has ceremonies. It has foodways. It has marriage practices. A culture is never based on one stone tool. But in the Americas, archaeologists have created the Clovis people. I have found books on the Clovis people in the cultural section of libraries. Clovis is a tool technology, not a culture. What that discussion did was to erase the diversity of all of the indigenous people of the Americas and create a pan-hemispheric Clovis culture. Never in the history of the world anywhere have we seen a culture bigger than a small regional area, certainly not the size of a continent. So there is a lot of hypocrisy in education and archaeology where they still use terms like the Clovis people because they never existed. The only place the so-called Clovis people ever existed was in the wildest imagination of the archaeological mind. So this is a map that I had in just recently published in Canadian Geographic. So the good thing where we have to discuss the past to learn where we're at today and where we're going, we have to discuss racism and bias in certain areas of education so we can change it in the present and make it better in the future. And so my book came out in 2021, and I wrote my book to help create a piece of healing for Indigenous people, to reclaim our histories and links to the land. What I did not foresee or even think about was the ramifications that this book and this knowledge and this data would have on major colonial institutions. So the Smithsonian recently released a new book of North American history, where they used to say we had been here 12,000 years. They now cite me and say we've been here at least 50,000 years. Canadian Geographic asked me if they could use my data and I would help them produce a map that showed people have been here over 300,000 years. So major colonial institutions have stood up to the status quo in American archaeology and said, you're wrong. And they are now publishing what is right based on scientific data, which is awesome, right? So what I found through my research is that there are actually hundreds of sites that predate Clovis. And you know, I always teach students, and I teach every academic I meet, that the first people and their descendants are indigenous to the continents of the Western Hemisphere and have been so for thousands of years. The Western Hemisphere is where their cultures, identities, and lifeways were born. This is where they are from. So we see archaeologists continually to call First Nations people Asians from Asia. And I need to remind them that Asia did not exist during the Pleistocene. Asia or Asian culture did not exist 13 or 14 or 20,000 years ago. We are not Asians from Asia. We are indigenous to these lands. We may have relations. We may have a genetic link to people who are in the lands today we know as Asia. But when you look into the deep past, there's no old world. There's no new world. There are no Asians. There are no Italians. There are no Africans. There are early humans throughout the world, and they are indigenous to the lands they inhabit. So stop calling indigenous people Asians from Asia, because it's hypocritical and it's scientifically wrong. They don't like it when I talk to them like that. But geopolitical terminologies are incorrectly used to make claims that Asians and Europeans settled the Americas. Such normalized and embedded discussions continue to erase indigenous peoples' histories and links to the land. So to further support the erasure of indigenous peoples, archaeologists normalized the mysterious disappearance of indigenous people, including the Clovis people. We are the world champions of hide and seek. This assures archaeologists that contemporary indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere are not related to the earliest people to have lived in the Western Hemisphere, and thus contemporary indigenous people have no claims to antiquity, lands, artifacts, their relations, human remains, or deep history. Thus, archaeologists retain power and control and ownership over the past and archaeological sites and the construction of indigenous histories. So this is North America around between 24 and 12,000 years ago. So this is when we were supposed to have come from what we know today as Asia, first migrated 12,000 years across thousands of miles of ice when there was no food and no viable migration route. It was impossible for us to have been here before. No, hello, it was impossible for humans to have crossed thousands of miles of ice with no food or water on the land, right? This is North America 2 million years ago. A lot of the continent was a subtropical forest. There was a lot of food. There were viable migration routes. There were links between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. There was a land-based migration route. How do we know this? Well, I'll get to that. This is what we call today Asia and Europe 2 million years ago. As you can see, early humans were in Northern Asia 2 million years ago. So we're supposed to believe that even though early humans migrated on foot 14,000 kilometers from Africa to Northern Asia, they couldn't go a few thousand more miles or the 57 miles across the land area that connected it to the Western Hemisphere. There might have been a toll bridge. They didn't have a quarter. Who knows? But they stopped. And so for 2 million years, even though they walked 14,000 kilometers, they didn't go any farther. There was a land bridge. There were migration routes. Who sees anything Canadian in this picture? Anybody? What about those Canadian geese in the sky? Because this is Ellesmere Island 3.5 million years ago. And that's because this is where camelid fossils were found. Camels arose in the Americas. They needed a land route to migrate. They couldn't fly like the geese, but they take land. But they needed a viable migration route. They needed food. They needed water. They needed safe places to sleep, to birth, to do their everyday things. So we have a really strong paleontological record that tells us when our four-legged relations were migrating between the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere. Thus, if our four-leggeds could migrate, so could the two-leggeds. And remember, two-leggeds were in Asia 2 million years ago, right? And four-leggeds were migrating. So Two-leggeds follow four-leggeds. They're yummy, right? So that's like a natural thing, but archaeologists denied that ever happened. It was impossible. No, it wasn't. Another of our four-legged relations that made that journey was the horse. So this is the earliest dawn horse. Horses first arose in the Americas. To get to the area we know today as Asia or anywhere else in the Eastern Hemisphere, they had to walk. They needed grazing. They needed huge amounts of grazing, huge amounts of fresh water, right? And who was following them? Saber-tooth, because they were yummy too. Animals as well as people. So saber-tooth, the oldest basal species of saber-tooth anywhere in the world, is from Florida 5 million years ago. How did saber-tooth get to the rest of the world? Likely followed the camels and the horses. And if saber-tooth followed them because he liked eating them, so too then could humans and two-leggeds. So we know there's a really strong set of evidence for migrations across a viable landmass between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. And that early humans were in Asia 2 million years ago, and that camels, horses, saber-tooths, and other creatures that arose in the Americas had to cross that way and back and forth. So there wasn't just one-way traffic. That's another thing that's been embedded in education. Oh, they came here one way once. Yeah, no. People go both ways all the time, as do mammals. So there are also mammals from the Eastern Hemisphere that arose there that migrated into what we call today the Americas. This is a site in Nebraska, one of the sites I worked on for my PhD dissertation. This is the Lacina site. The big pile of gravel and rocks you see there is a berm that was built to protect the site. So research went on at this site, excavations for 11 years, and then they backfilled it. The whole site wasn't excavated, so they created this berm as protection for when the reservoir rose. This site dated to 22,000 years before present, and what I'm doing there is I'm collecting mammoth bone that's eroding out of the unexcavated area of the site. I'm standing on this side closest to me of that berm, and there's mammoth bone eroding out of that cliff face. So every summer they go out and collect anything so that it's not lost. This is the site when it was being excavated. It was, the water at times was right up to the edge of the cliff. They had to be very careful. But in 11 years, they gathered a lot of data. So what they found at this site was mammoth bone that was spirally fractured. Mammoth bone is very, very dense. Even a short-faced bear, a prehistoric bear, couldn't get their mouth around and break it. It was too big and too dense. The only way to break mammoth bone is to take a boulder and smash it. Well, we know there's a record everywhere in the world of early humans using small boulders to break open dense bones to get the marrow and to get the bone to make tools. We find a lot of bone tools. And so Dr. Holland, who originally excavated this site, was very careful in documenting the evidence and doing testing to show the only way to break an elephant or a mammoth bone was with a boulder, and you end up with spiral fracturing. So on this map, number 1 is the Lacina site. So when I looked at a specific site, I know that people didn't just fall out of a plane. If they're in New Mexico, if they're in Nebraska, they have to be sites in the area. Thankfully, archaeologists had documented and recorded sites in the area that date from 14,000 to 22,000 years. So what you can see is it's not just a Lacina site. We have a big regional area that at the time, 14 to 22,000 years ago, was just about 500 miles south of the very southern edge of the glacier. So now we know we have a possible cultural regional area within a given time frame. This is a berm in Southern California. They wanted to build a connector between the coastal highway and the mountain highway that went north-south. So just above San Diego, they dug this. I think it was maybe 14 or 21 miles. It wasn't very long. They found 121 sites in that short space. One of the sites they found was the Soretti site. So the San Diego Museum of Man and the geologists and archaeologists called in Dr. Holland, and they assessed the artifacts from this site. So what you see here that mammoth bone on the very top, you'll see there's a nice notch out of the top. And that's where it was bashed, was one of these boulders that were brought to the site. They were not in their geological frame where they should have been. They were brought in by obviously humans. So everyone that worked on this site knew that it was very old and it would be very contentious. So they put all the materials away at the Museum of Man and waited, I think it was over 10 years, for dating to get to a place where it could not absolutely be questioned on a really old bone. And when they dated it, it dated to 130,000 years before present. And so Dr. Holland and the others, Dr. Soretti, knew they had a fight on their hands to get this article published. But so they were extremely careful in their data, their dating, and their testing. And they did get it published in Nature. So here, this is another site I studied for my dissertation. Here you see number 1 is the Soretti site. Number 2 is a site in the desert, I believe. I can't read it over there. Number 3, the Calico site is up there. So here we have an area where I personally know around number 1, there are 8 other sites where ancient tools have been collected. Plus there are these other 5 published sites. I also know that in central Mexico around a reservoir, there are 5 sites dated by the United States Geological Survey, who don't get things wrong, and all 5 sites had dates from 40,000 to 200,000 years. As you got deeper, the sites got older, they had stone tools. So here, once again, between Southern California and central New Mexico, we have a regional area with dates from 40,000 to 200,000 years. So we have a beginning place for understanding early peoples in this area. And this has all been denied by archaeologists forever. So this is Linda Tuwali Smith. She's a Maori scholar, and she said that, you know, histories which extend from the ancient past to the living present as one are key to cultural survival for all people. And she said it's no surprise then that one of the first aspects of Indigenous being that suffered from intentional eradication by colonizing forces were histories which testified to a deep, ancient, and civilized past. So this also took place in Australia and other Indigenous nations where their deep history and links to the land were denied as being impossible, you know, until basically they were discovered by settlers who civilized them. We are still, believe it or not, working to change those kinds of colonial, racial, biased stories about the Indigenous past. There has, however, recently been a shift in some archaeologists thinking regarding the ancient Indigenous past. So I did a survey. I recently did a survey of 168 archaeologists, mostly in North America and Canada, but some other parts of the world. I wanted to see what their thinking was in the short year that my book has come out, because a lot of other sites have now been published, even since my book came out, that are much older than 20,000 years. So we had about over 65% of archaeologists now believe that people were here at least before 24,000 years before present. So the last glaciation blocked that migration route across the Bering Land area around 25,000 years ago. 70%, 65 to 70, that's a huge number. That is a big change. Previous to my book coming out, I know that archaeologists never consulted Indigenous people, and most of them, when asked, would say, oh no, there's no real historical data in oral traditions or rock art. At least this group of respondents changed their mind. So 65 to 70% now believe there is definitely accurate historical information in rock art. A lot of it depicts ancient species that have been extinct for thousands of years. And there is knowledge and history held in oral traditions. So we are seeing a very recent sea change in American archaeology. That doesn't mean that it automatically becomes a non-biased safe space. It doesn't. My own experience shows that it's still a very biased, very racialized place. Hence, I'm working at Algoma University where there is no archaeology program, because even though I've done a number of interviews for positions in archaeology schools, I have not been hired. And I've actually been screamed at in those interviews to change how I talk about archaeologists. And I've said, no, no, thank you. But Creator takes care of his own. Creator gave me a job to do, and I'm fine. I'm at a great university. It's grown in leaps and bounds. I have a Canada Research Chair. I have tenure. I couldn't ask for anything better. I guide my own research, and I listen to elders, and I'm surrounded by elders from Batchewana and from Garden River and from the Métis community that I can reach out to and that I, can meet up with and discuss things with any day of the week. So it's really a blessing. So I had asked archaeologists also about 10 different sites that date to older than what we call older than Clovis, or older than 11,200 years. The younger the site was, the more accepted it was. The older you got, the least accepted it was. So archaeologists are beginning to inch their way back in time, but I think there's been so much evidence now, including the White Sands site, which, if you haven't heard of it, the White Sands site is in New Mexico, and there are footprints, human footprints with extinct mammal footprints that are dated to over 23,000 years before present. And the nature of things, David Suzuki's last episode was on the White Sands Park. I was in that documentary. They did interview archaeologists who had worked on sites, and they framed kind of the documentary around the argument of my book is that, yes, we have been here much earlier, and everyone has a right to know that and to understand the evidence of that, because it's been denied for so long. So I began, there's cost. There's been a recent shift, but there's been a historical cost for the uncritical acceptance of knowledge produced via biases used to filter those data, such as the Clovis first hypothesis of initial migrations. Histories which extend from the ancient past to the living present are one, and they are key to cultural survival for all people. The greatest price of the denial of Indigenous links to the land have been paid by the Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, who have long endured soul wounds and social political disparities created in part through archaeological cleaved links to ancestral places and times. So a small group of settler archaeologists also paid a high price, because when they published on sites that were older than Clovis, when they argued people had been here longer, they were fired. They were called crazy. They were called bad archaeologists. Louis Leakey, the most famous paleontologist in the world, who found all the early humans and founded, an organization in Africa for early human evolution, said that the site in Southern California, not the Sereti site, but another site, was between 40,000 to 200,000 years old. And the archaeologists in America said, oh, he's a crazy old man and a drunk. Not he's a world famous great paleontologist. They immediately dehumanized him. And they did that with everyone that published on an earlier site. And there's no need for that anywhere in the world. We don't know everything there is to know about human history. We haven't turned over every piece of dirt. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of changes that have been made to your basic understanding of human evolution, including 5 new early hominid species over the last 10 years. So I began my research journey by asking some questions regarding the paleo-environmental possibilities of Pleistocene migrations and the evidence of older than Clovis sites in the Western Hemisphere. From what I have learned, I argue there is a vast body of evidence that supports initial migrations to the Western Hemisphere in both directions much earlier than archaeologists have argued for. Much, much earlier, as early as 200 to 300,000 years. Okay, so there's a few takeaway messages for students, and I take these from a lot of questions students have asked. Think critically about what you are taught and what you are not taught. Consider where the lessons you are being taught come from. Always reach out to experts in your field of study or any field of study you're interested in. Seek knowledge from Indigenous, minority scholars and their informed, unbiased settler peers who decolonize, indigenize education. So do not carry the burden of guilt from past generations, from what was done or taught before your time. Do work to make the world a better place, to create paths and spaces of healing for the next 7 generations. Learn about and follow the 7 grandfather teachings. So thank you. Now we have time for Q&A.
Thank you, Paulette. So we have time for questions. We have a couple of microphones if there are any questions here. We also have the streaming service being run right now, and well, we get it. Let me open it up. Anybody got any questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This was mind-blowing. I really enjoyed this. I spent a lot of time at the University of Alberta hanging out with paleontologists and archaeologists, chasing chert and things like that at McMaster. And one of the things that was really interesting working with a person who worked with Native Studies is they had an exchange group between the Cree of the North and the Navajo of the South. And what they found, she came home and she was running and she said, they have common stories. They realize they have common stories. So they have a shared history. What was interesting though at the time, if I recall, it's been a while, was that they were trying to figure out who was there first, right? Like where did the stories come? Did they come from the north to the south, or did they come from the south to the north? And there seemed to be suggestion that they came from the north, from the south to the north, and there was resistance for this. So my question is there some kind of cultural anthropological research that looks at all of these stories in that sort of new, in that context that's sort of out there and bolsters this? Or did the archaeology that you're talking about come after? Did the stories inspire the archaeology, or other way around?
Well, you have to remember that we're still at a place of learning and trying to open up anthropologists and archaeologists' minds. So in the Cree world, in the Dene world, in the Indigenous world, North and South didn't exist, right? Who came first didn't exist. And if you look into Indigenous languages, they're incredibly metaphorical. Oral traditions are incredibly metaphorical. I had to work for months to understand one. Indigenous people organized their knowledge by the world around them they were connected to, the stars, right? If you want to understand where a language may have first been used, you would look to the history of where the stars were. You would speak to the Indigenous people, and you have to learn to listen in a way that you begin to understand their languages and their metaphors. So anthropologists and archaeologists don't speak Indigenous languages. A few of them have, but the majority of them don't even realize that to understand Indigenous histories and oral traditions based in Indigenous languages, why don't you think about first learning the language and then listening to the people? So all these concepts about what came first and where from, they're not a part of oral traditions. And so I was recently reading an article by an Indigenous group that spoke to the history of the political rule of their world based on the stars and the seasons and where they were. And there's plenty of evidence from monumental structures in the pre-Columbian Indigenous world that they used star paths and star alignments and, you know, different times of the years. We only tell certain stories in the winter. We only tell certain stories in the summer. And that way you're starting to see how the Indigenous people wove all of their relations, all of the land, the oceans, the land, the skies, everything through their stories. And so we have to teach ourselves to stop thinking in frames of east, north, south, west. Even though I talk about the Eastern and Western Hemisphere, because I haven't found another name that fits both continents for all people. But when it comes to their own histories and their place and their practices, we have to start to try to learn it from their worldviews. And we're a bit away from that, but having Indigenous educators and Indigenous students now coming into the academy and bringing in Indigenous elders, we will create those spaces where we can begin to understand Indigenous histories and practices from their own worldviews, hopefully.
Thank you.
Oops.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. Paulette, I have a question. So my background is oceanography and physical oceanography, and the limited connection that I've had to Indigenous stories actually has been a much shorter time scale, looking at tsunamis on the west coast of North America and the amazing connections between traditional stories and observations of tsunamis hitting the coast. That's just 300 years. Trying to relate back to tens of thousands of years seems complicated in terms of dating stuff. So I'm a scientist, I'm a science geek, but I'm not that familiar with the dating side of things. Most of us have probably heard of carbon dating. You talked about the improvements in dating technology. So what has changed? Do you know, I mean, in terms of what's better about the dating? They're using different things, or is it still sort of just more sophisticated carbon dating? What's the methodology that they're using to date effectively?
Well, they use thermoluminescence for the really old dates. And it is one thing that scientists have gotten very, very good at. There's two, there's a few ways of dating. One is looking at the soils. And so I learned, as a graduate student going out with Dr. Holland, who was my graduate fieldwork mentor, we could walk up to what you call a cut bank, somewhere a reservoir had washed away all of the dirt, and the bank is like 40 feet high, and you're like, wow. And at the bottom, hippopotamus and camelid and horse bones are coming out of the soil. So we know that's, well over 12,000 years, and it turns out it was over 40,000 years. But we can see where what we call the Pleistocene loess. So the nice, light, sandy, dusty soil from the Pleistocene built up to a level of 28 feet. And we can see the top of it. So we know, okay, that's, 8,000 or 12,000. And we can see the bottom. So we know anything we find in the bottom is 28,000 years. So there's been a lot of really, I call them crazy dirt guys. They go out and they will read the soil with such intensity, and they will map every little corner of Nebraska, so they know the age of every exposed soil, or soil core everywhere. And that is just a really beautiful data set for us to understand and to build arguments from, because everywhere I went in Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado, I was finding camel bone and horse bone, and one of my peers found a saber-toothed tooth out there. And so we know that these species existed when humans existed because we're finding them with stone tools and evidence of lithics. But on the scientific side, I look at these rooms where these scientists have created things like thermoluminescence dating technology. I'm like, how does a mind figure out those thousands of pipes and wires? Like, these are the brilliant guys. Oh my God, they're amazing. But we can now use much smaller samples. So it was really a problem before. You had to destroy a whole tooth or a big sample to get anything. Now we can get DNA out of tooth just by washing it in fluid. And now we can use teeny tiny bits of carbon to get a date from, you know, or a piece of bone. So the amount we need to destroy to get a date has been really made much smaller, and the technologies have been made more foolproof, because there's a lot of question on dating technologies, but the science has really helped. And the genetics has really helped too. It's just that people are not yet talking in ways that are decolonized, and they're still calling us Asians from Asia. And I'm like, quit saying that, you know, smack you on the hand. But I think some of them are starting to get it. But you know, it all comes from a place of power and authority. So it's a huge change. Once a specific group has power and authority, they just don't turn around and give it back. So now they've had power and authority over our history and keeping us as recent Asians from Asia that only got here 11 or 12,000 years ago for 100 years. And there are a lot of them are having a really hard time giving that up. But I say creators working is magic. So many sites have been published in the last year and a half since my book came out. White Sands, Chiquiti Cave. There is no question now, as my survey showed, 70% of 65, 70% of archaeologists, okay, we give up. You know, they've been here 25,000 years. There's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of racism, bias, and colonialism to get rid of. And I created a word in 2012 called pyroepistemology. And so we used fire technologies to clean the land, to burn away the underbush and the overgrowth. And that made more space for the sun to come in and for the good life, those foods we needed to grow back. So pyroepistemology is a metaphorical term for burning away those colonial bias discussions in academia, or the books. I'm not telling you to burn books, but and making space for Indigenous and decolonized voices to grow new knowledge in the academy that push back on racism, bias, and misunderstanding. I asked a group of students, I taught a class of 320 at UMass Amherst from all over the world. I asked at the beginning of the class, what do you know about the Indigenous people of the Americas? They all wrote me a page. A lot of them mentioned Christopher Columbus discovered us. I was like, ah. At the end of the class, I'm like, what do you know about Indigenous people now, and has your worldview changed? 95%, the other 5% were already informed. 95%, yes, my worldview has totally changed. That changes, you know, the next lawyers, the business people, the politicians, the doctors. That changes their worldview of Indigenous people because their understanding becomes informed, and you've been able to push back on embedded racism and discrimination. That's what we want to do. It's not our generation that's going to make this change. It's the generation of all these students that's going to make this change. And we're helping to give you the tools to do that. So some days it doesn't matter to me if people have been here 50,000 years or 500,000 years. I'm going to keep chasing that and keep supporting that and keep getting evidence. What really matters is creating a path of healing and reconciliation for all of our children, for the next 7 generations, so their worldviews are informed and they can make good decisions based on decolonized minds, hearts, and spirits. That's the important work, is just to inform students and show them there is a way to create a better path of healing for all of our people for the next 7 generations.
Mark Sayers, Garden River First Nation. So anyways, around the cities, and I have a lot of Asian friends, eh? And I jokingly refer to them as my elder brothers, you know, the whole thing with the Bering Strait, you know what I mean? So anyways, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, so I came across a scholar, African-American scholar from Harvard University, Dr. David Imhotep, I believe is his name. And I read a little bit about his research, and he, in his research, he claims that the Black Africans are the original peoples of Turtle Island, and that they came across here 180,000 years ago. And over time, they when the Mongolians came over, they mixed, and then that resulting in Native Americans. This is the claim, according to his research, that he put forward. Anyways, that sort of like, to me, you know, I can't accept that. But I just want to know if what your thoughts are on that, if
Well,
what he's saying.
Africans in an African culture didn't exist 180,000 years ago. Like I say, I'm trying to get this more out there in academic discussions, that scientists stop abusing their authority on knowledge to make those kinds of geopolitical claims. So we didn't have Africa 180,000 years ago. Sure, early humans could have came from the continent we know today as Africa, or the continent we know today as Asia, but they were early humans. They were not African, they were not Asian. We do have huge carvings in some Central American areas with figures that do have what look like Afrocentric facial features. But people, early humans, were going all over the world. Archaeology, and I knew this years ago, I never chased it, I just knew it. I knew that Neanderthals and early humans interbred. Archaeologists were arguing 10 years ago was impossible, it never happened, and I'm like, I'm certain from what I've seen, it did, and it was never impossible. And so you got these created stories where people came one time, they went one way, oh, and then it becomes that. No. We have evidence of humans using open water transport 100,000 years ago to get to Crete. Humans are traveling the globe. The only thing that has constrained that is contemporary archaeologists wishing for power and control, trying to create a story based on their conjecture. So when you come across that kind of data, what you have to do at those kind of articles is look at what is their data? What are they citing? What are they basing this on? And what else is there? So most archaeologists study, you know, a nice village in Arizona, or the pottery from New Mexico, or the stone tools from Northern Ontario. I must be nuts. My archaeology site wasn't this nice little compact area. It was all of North and South America, kind of big archaeology site. But then I had to expand it to the whole world. So as a graduate student, I actually took a certificate on early human and human evolution. And I delved into genetics. I delved into all of the early humans. I learned that, as Nova claims in a clip online, our earliest human ancestors are from Montana. The oldest proto-primates in the world, 65 million years ago, are from Montana and Saskatchewan. Does anyone here get taught that the earliest human ancestors are from North America? No, you get taught that humans were never here. So I have a book chapter out in a very nice scientific book about our earliest human ancestors, and how the story that the scientists tell is the same story that the Indigenous people tell when we say we have been here since time immemorial. If Nova can say our earliest human primate ancestors are from Montana, and there are human ancestors, we can say we've been here since time immemorial. Thank you. So you have to look for those opportunities to really question those people's data and what they're using. I've seen that person's work. I've seen those claims. I understand that we had early peoples in the Americas that some looked more Asian, what we might call today as Asian. People had different affinities. You can tell nothing, however, from the shape of a skull. You can't tell skin color. You can't tell the shape of a nose. You can't tell, you know, the texture of hair. So we don't know that information. We just know that early humans were here. And the oldest human remains found in the Americas only date to around 11 to 12,000 years ago. First of all, nobody was looking. Second of all, there were so many huge Pleistocene species here, even burials likely didn't last unless they were very deep, right? And so that's another enigma we haven't gotten to yet. We need to dig much deeper. Some sites have been found that are 60 or 80 feet deep when we see a cut bank. But nobody can claim that anybody came from Africa 180,000 years ago. There was no Africa, there was no African culture. There were early humans. And mammals and humans were traveling all over the world. They did not have geopolitical identities. So.
Miigwech.
Thank you for having me. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.